Hi everyone, thanks for coming to my talk. It's a real honor to be here with you at WordPress WordCamp Brisbane. I really appreciate you coming. So today I'm going to talk to you about an updated look at best practices for WordPress, because I started learning WordPress about 10 years ago, and the best practices that I was learning back 10 years ago aren't necessarily the same best practices as what we have today. And actually, the best practices that you might see, mentioned in the WordPress Codex aren't always the best practices that we would have today. And WordPress has changed a lot in the last 2 years or so. It's got a whole heap of new technologies, and the way that we're using it is changed as well. And with all these changes also comes new best practices. So the reason for my talk today actually goes back 10 years to when I was first starting out as a front-end developer. I had learned CSS in high school, like most people of my generation, and so I'd gotten a job doing a bit of front-end and really starting to excel at the CSS thing. And I was getting maybe a little bit cocky, a bit confident in my ability with CSS. And then 2 new technologies came out, Less and Sass. Do you remember those? There was like a bit of a Sass and Less war for a while there, and people were sort of going all in on one technology or the other and sort of choosing their sides in this fight. And maybe I didn't have the time, or maybe I was a little bit worried about choosing the wrong team, but for whatever reasons, I sort of made up my mind that the best thing to do was just stick with the original CSS. Because, all of that CSS, that new stuff that's coming out, you got to run extra stuff, and it all just compiles back to CSS anyway. And so this sort of early 20s cocky me was like, no, I just stick with the good stuff, the stuff that I wrote back in my day. I stick with the original form of it. And I remember even going to a job interview, and the job interviewer said to me, so which CSS preprocessor do you use, Less or Sass? And I said to him, oh, no, I don't go in for all that preprocessor stuff. I just stick with the good stuff, original plain CSS. And I was like, I did not get that job. That was about the end of the interview right there. But what actually happened, because I never learnt Less and I never learnt Sass, is that then I missed out on the train where we started getting into grunt and gulp, right? And so I never understood really grunt, and I never really understood gulp, and there's their own little war happening there now. And so even then a step further is, because I never really got grunt and gulp, that means that I never really understood composer and bower and these sorts of things. And I feel like I sort of really got left behind this sort of particular technology train. And these days I'm trying to learn React, and like a lot of people here I know are. And the hardest part in all of that for me is figuring out the manifests and the dependency trees and NPM, and figuring out how all of the YAML files work and all of that sort of stuff. That's actually really difficult for me, and you can sort of see how you can trace that back to not understanding Less or Sass back in the day when I was first doing it. So yeah, that's the reason why I want to give this talk, because there's some new tech in WordPress, and I'm not going to explain exactly how you're going to use it. I'm not going to go through the source code and say, this is this function, this is that function, this is how you do it. I want you to be inspired to do your own deep dives, spend your own time with these particular topics, because, and so my talk is going to focus in around use case. Here's how you could use these different aspects of WordPress. There's 3 aspects we're going to talk about. First is that wiggling? How do we go? Oh, what's happening? It's wiggling? Oh, the first is the REST API, which is that one up there. REST API it just enables a whole new different ways of doing WordPress. So we're going to talk about some of the best practices for using WordPress with the REST API and what the REST API is actually able to enable within WordPress and some of what I've used it for. The second one up there is the customizer. So the customizer has been in WordPress for quite a while now, and hopefully you're all familiar with it. But more recently in WordPress, the customizer sort of has gone a bit of a change in the underlying technology that powers it, and it's opened a whole new sort of world of possibility of what we can share with our clients and what we can do with the customizer. So we'll be talking about that. New people coming in, don't worry, I haven't actually started yet. And I'm just sort of talking about what I'm going to cover and why I'm going to cover it. So, in case you missed it, first one is we're going to talk about the REST API, because you don't want to get left behind with these new technology trends and end up not understanding the next thing and the next thing and the next thing that follows on from them. So this presentation is about inspiring you to do your own deep dive in each of these trends, and the topics that I'm going to cover are just going to be use cases and ideas for opportunities that you might see to implement some of this technology so you can get practiced with it. So Customizer, it's got new underlying sort of framework that really changes some of the possibilities. And then lastly, translation. You may or may not be aware that the way that WordPress plugins and themes are translated has actually changed last year completely. And there's a whole new framework for doing translation in your theme or your plugin. And I'll talk about that and how you can move your theme or plugin over to the new method of translation. Come on, computer. What's going on? Did it wiggle yet? Maybe I have to space bar that thing. No? Come on. Oh, okay, I think I got it. All right, here we go. It's the mouse click. Come on, it's got to be the mouse click. Oh, we reset? All right, that's good. And there we go. The REST API. You can drive it. Yeah, it works. All right. So, when we're thinking about the REST API, if you're anything like me, you're a developer and you're going, I've heard about this REST API thing. I want to be able to use it, but I don't know where I can use it. Maybe I do client work, and I don't know how I can actually find an opportunity to implement it in my everyday work. Right? So there's two important benefits of the REST API, and if you look at the icons that I've chosen, you might be able to guess them. This one is easy. REST API, it can be a full replacement for your admin Ajax. All right, so I'll talk about that, but first I'm going to talk about WordPress as a Headless CMS. All right. All right. Or decoupled CMS. They mean slightly different things, but we're going to refer to them as sort of similar in this case. All right. So what is a headless CMS? WordPress can be completely decoupled from the front end of your website. All right. So what we're talking about here is taking the WP admin area, all of the WordPress that we know and love with that, the blue and gray sidebar and our post edit screen and everything like that. And then typically, if we wanted to display WordPress posts or a site on the front end, we would use a theme, right? We'd use a WordPress theme. And typically, that WordPress theme would contain a whole bunch of WordPress functions to display things like the_title, _, semicolon. And that theme would really only work with WordPress, right? Because it's just full of WordPress functions all the way through it. So one of the things that we can do is decouple our theme, the visual presentation of our website, with the CMS, with the management of all of the posts and pages Does that make sense? But part of the decoupled CMS part, we can create a fully JavaScript application that maybe doesn't use PHP at all, and it can be super fast and neat, and we can definitely do that with the REST API. But we can actually go beyond that, and one of the projects that XWP has worked on is, by the way, I don't think I was introduced, but I work at XWP. I lead the product team there, and one of the projects that we've worked on was actually for Beachbody, which is a sort of popular fitness company in the United States. And their main line of business was producing fitness DVDs, workout DVDs, right? So they realized, we got to get with the times. We want to have an Apple TV app. But the Apple TV app has got to work with our iOS app, and like the same content is also going to go on our website for our, behind a paywall. How do we do that? Well, because we're able to decouple the management of all the content from the displaying of it on the website, we could also use the REST API to inform the app, right? So the app could talk directly with WordPress via the REST API, and we could also do the Apple TV. And actually the Apple TV stuff was all web-based anyway, and so it sent just a JSON request to WordPress, and the REST API was set up to handle providing the content back to the Apple TV app. And we set it up with the customizer as well, which I'll go into later, but it was this great solution because we had almost like a dam, a digital asset management system, using WordPress as a dam, and then using the REST API to enable all these other integrations outside of it. So that's what it means to use WordPress as a headless CMS. And the REST API enables that. So as you're going about your work, if you see an opportunity to use WordPress content, maybe you want to create a decoupled theme or use your WordPress content in another way, then maybe start thinking about setting up a theme or an app to work and pull posts via JSON, via JavaScript with the REST API. The second way that you can use the REST API is as a replacement for admin.ajax.php. So who here has set up some Ajax requests within a theme or a plugin? Yep, a lot on this side of the room. So Ajax requests are good, but they can be better. So the problem with an Ajax request is every time you make a request, you have to set up some PHP to run the result or get the results that you're looking for based on the information that you sent, and write it all out and return a response, right? Well, you have to do that every time you create a new admin Ajax sort of thing, and you've got all of this code, and you're constantly reinventing the wheel. And most of the time, if you're anything like me, most of the time it's just running a WP query, right? It's just getting posts back. And so rather than using admin Ajax, you can send a request to the WordPress REST API and just not have to write any of that response stuff in PHP at all. It's all JavaScript driven. And you can just say, give me these posts with these parameters. In addition, REST API, when it returns stuff back, it gets rid of a lot of the WordPress cruft that sort of hangs around in PHP in the WP query response. Things like post_content. It's just all simplified and prettified so that you can use that in any sort of application, and maybe even replace WordPress as the content source in the future if you need to, and the other stuff that you're developing should still work fairly well because it's not reliant on these old WordPress naming conventions and things like that. The other great thing, a good reason for using the REST API as a replacement for admin Ajax is that you get to define a schema. So if you're not necessarily going to just call the REST API for the existing endpoints, that may be a way that you use it, but also you can create your own custom endpoints, and when you create those API endpoints, you create a schema. And what that means is you say, I'm expecting to get an integer, an ID, which is going to be a type of an integer, and I'm expected to get this parameter and that parameter, and they're expected to be these types, and this parameter is required, and this one is optional, right? And you define all that in a schema. And that means that when you're calling the endpoint, you don't have to write all of this code out, which says, check if this value is sent, and if not, return an error, and write out how the error is being returned, and write out a custom error message, and then check if the type of this particular parameter is correct. And you don't have to write out any of that stuff because it's all handled by the REST API. So where you can, using the REST API as a replacement for admin Ajax, and I'd say that's almost anywhere that you're using admin Ajax, is a really good idea. So it's a really easy opportunity to start getting some experience with the REST API. Less reinventing the wheel. When should you not use the REST API? Ryan, any thoughts?
Never use it at all.
There are two schools of thought on when you should not use the REST API. And the first one is related to HTTP requests. So the theory here goes, suppose you're loading your latest posts in a widget, but you want to do that via the REST API so they can update a minute later. So that widget's always up to date, right? And that's happening in the sidebar. So the theory goes that you load the page, and then as the page is loading or after the page is loaded, then you have to your site is automatically making another HTTP request back to your server to then load in those latest posts, which makes things a bit slower and is sort of doubling the server hit for every page load, right? So that would be a pretty valid reason to not use the REST APIs if you're worried about that. However, there is a way around it, which is pretty simple, and we'll look quickly at some code here with my imaginary laser pointer. What you can do instead is run an internal query using the REST API during page load. All right, so rather than waiting for the page to load and then using JavaScript to get a query straight away, to do a REST API call straight away, you can run an internal REST API call during page load, and it's really easy. You just define your request as a new request, put in the endpoint. I won't go over this in detail, but you can see you're setting the parameters there, and you dispatch the request, apply filters, and then you use this response to data. And then all you're doing then, you've got the posts at this point, and then you just echo them out. You put a script tag, and you're going to echo JSON encode the posts. And you just do that while your page is loading, and then you don't have to run 2 HTTP requests as soon as a page loads. You've got that data ready to go, and then in your JavaScript you can refer to that and refresh it a minute later or 30 seconds later if you'd like to. So that can be overcome, that issue. There is another reason when not to use the REST API. And this is somewhat edge case, but it's when you're talking about really contextualized information. So a good example here is either your top-level menus, or suppose you had a widget that was going to pull through the menu items there. Well, we all know that menus are just a post type. Maybe we don't all know that, but developers know menu items are just a post type, so no reason why we couldn't just fetch the menu with the REST API, right? And that way it's loaded dynamically, and if it changes, it'll automatically update, that sort of thing. But menus require information about the current page that you're on or the current post that you're on so that they can output the right CSS. So they can say, this is the current page as a class. And the REST API doesn't work very well when it comes to contextualized, context-specific information. It works better in more broad terms. I'm getting a couple of blank looks, so I think I'll move on from that one. So that's when not to use the REST API. But my advice, get in and get your hands dirty with it, with whatever opportunity you can, so that you're maintaining your sort of currency. It's one thing to sort of do a deep dive, and it's another thing entirely to incorporate it with the way that you work. So if you decide, I'm going to completely replace my admin Ajax usage, you can go back and do that and learn about it, but then also decide I'm not going to use admin Ajax anymore in the future unless I really have to. All right. Next item that I'll talk about is the customizer. Like I said before, there's been some changes in the sort of core architecture which supports the customizer pretty recently. So there was a problem in WordPress with the customizer prior to WordPress 4.7, which was if you did an Ajax request or even a REST API call on the front end of your page, well, you would still see the results of that if you were customizing the page, right? You'd see the front end load. But any changes that you made, they wouldn't be reflected in that data that was fetched dynamically. So if we go back to that latest posts widget that we saw before, or better example, the menus widget that we saw before, right? Suppose that menus widget is being fetched with JavaScript, and then you change the menus in the customizer. Well, the JavaScript is going to go and fetch the current live menus, not the current previewed menus. So that was a bit of a problem, sort of not widely experienced, but with sort of, you can see the architecture of the way it was sort of built, right? So that was fixed in 4.7 with a feature called change sets. And not very many people realize that change sets exist. What change sets actually allows you to do is it assigns a UUID automatically to all of the changes that you're making collectively in the customizer. And what that then would allow you to do is, in theory, you could share a set of changes. Actually, you can do that right now in WordPress. It's a little bit complicated because there's no UI, but if you're in the customizer, say you've got a client site, right? And your client has said, you know what, the colors are good, but they need a pop. And you said, okay, whatever you say, client, I'll make the colors pop. So you go into the customizer and you change the color in your theme. And then what? Do you just make it live? Yeah, you're previewing it, great. But what does your customer do? How do you get your customer to sign off on that before you just publish it live? So what you can actually do is just right now, you can right-click in the previewed window, right-click on one of the links on your site, open a new tab, and then copy the URL from that tab. And you'll see in the URL will be a UUID, like a sort of long ID number, and that will let your customer see the changes that you're previewing before they're live. Did you know you could do that in WordPress right now? There you go. So I actually recommend installing a plugin called Customize Snapshots. And all Customize Snapshots does is adds a UI layer which takes advantage of the change sets, which it will have a button there for sharing. Share the URL or share this customized state with your client. Or even better is then, suppose you've got a WooCommerce store and you want to have a sale, all right? So maybe you've scheduled all of your posts to change at a particular time to update the prices, but you also want to change the colors or change the theme or change other aspects, and it all has to go live at midnight on the 24th. How are you going to do that without waking up at midnight? Well, prior to WordPress 4.7, it wasn't really possible. But now, because of change sets, if you install a plugin which takes advantage of the core technology of change sets, which Snapshots does, you can schedule a set of changes altogether to go live. And actually, you can take a bunch of changes altogether and export those changes and share them with people and send them to people and import them and preview them and publish them at a scheduled date. So that's all possible with the customizer now, and I just recommend installing Snapshots to get the UI to be able to do that. Does that make sense? So that's change sets.
The powers that be are trying to get the program back on track. So I bet
I'll see how we go. Do my best. No promises. The other really cool thing with the customizer that lots of people aren't aware of is the customizer JavaScript API. Has anybody even heard of it? A couple of people maybe? No? One? I got one hand. 2 hands? All right. 3 hands. All right. 4 hands. All right. I'm not going to count. A few people. So, okay, here's another hands up question. If you were going to create a theme or a plugin that needed a customizer control so that you could edit something in the customizer, have that section for it, would you do it in PHP? A couple of people would put their hands up for PHP. Okay, you can do it in PHP, that's fine. But it's a bit slower. Especially on sites that have heaps of posts or heaps of widgets, PHP is going to be loaded for, like your section is going to be loaded multiple times. It's not the best way of doing it. But get in your head now that next time you develop a customizer control, number one, it's really easy. Number two, you can do it completely in JavaScript without any PHP at all, except to on-queue the JavaScript. All right? So at the top here, I've got, this is how you would normally do it in PHP. You would add action, then, inline function here, and then you do WP customize add section with the parameters that you specified, right? This bottom bit, though, is how you do it in JavaScript, and it's basically the same. It's actually about the same amount of code, but there's some extra parameters there. And it's really as simple as on-queuing this JavaScript at the customize controls on-queue scripts point, and just make sure you use the dependency so that customize controls is loaded first. And then you can just put this script in your JavaScript file, and it will add in a section into the customizer in that few amount of lines without using any sort of PHP there. And the advantages of doing it that way as opposed to with PHP is that it's much more scalable and it's much, much faster because these controls only get loaded as they're needed. So that's the customizer JavaScript API. All right. Next and last, I'd like to talk to you about translation. Okay, so WordPress completely changed the way that we're going to translate our plugins and themes last year sometime. Because prior to this change, if you have a plugin or a theme, I'll use Stream as an example, one that I've helped work on, which is what would happen with Stream is we had people using it, say, in Portuguese, and they'd have their admin install in Portuguese, and then they'd install Stream, which didn't have a Portuguese translation. So they would then open up some special software that they had to download, and they'd use these special files that were included with the plugin to then automatically pull through a list of strings, and then they would type in translations for each of the strings. Then they would email it to me. And then I would go, I don't speak Portuguese, but this is probably legit, right? And so I'll just include it with the next plugin update so that everyone can have Portuguese. And actually what would then happen is that Reynard, who's running his system in Afrikaans, he would update Stream and have to download the Portuguese language pack, even though he's never going to use Portuguese. So it's not like this ideal workflow because I have to trust the person who's giving me the translation, that they know what they're talking about, and I'm distributing that to everyone. And my guess is that probably accounted for about half of the code base, like half of the size of every zip file plugin that was downloaded was just the translation files. And then especially if people are trying to upload with FTP, and you've got to wait for the PO and the MO and the PO and the MO and the PO and the MO files to all go up, and there's 30 translations in different languages, is a real pain. It's not the best way of doing it. So the way that we do translation changed. And the way it's handled now is much more effective. Plugins are distributed without any translations. And then if you have your WordPress install set to a particular language, so say you've set yours to ENAU, that's what I like to set mine to. If when you install a plugin, your WordPress install will talk with WordPress.org and say, I'm installing Stream. Is there an Australian translation for Stream? .org replies and says, yes, there happens to be an Australian translation for Stream. And here it is. And then your WordPress install downloads just the translation files that you need, as opposed to all of the translation files. In addition, we now have like community responsibility around translation because it's all handled on WordPress.org. So translators can go to .org, find a plugin that they like, translate it. Someone who is a trusted community member for that language will then go and approve the translations, and then those translations will become available to everyone immediately. And there's no emailing the plugin author, no hoping that the plugin author decides to include the translation with the next release, and no distributing it to everybody who doesn't need it. Much, much nicer way of doing it. So how do we update our plugins to include to work with this new way of doing it? Well, the first thing you need to realize is that .org will have already pulled through your PO and MO files, so it already has an awareness of your current translation level. You don't have to worry about redoing all of that. But here's what you'll have to do in your code. Delete the load plugin text domain bit. Before I go any further, I just need to be clear that this only works for plugins that are in the directory. If you're creating a custom plugin for a client who needs multiple languages or some other sort of distribution model, maybe hosting on my personal favorite website for buying premium themes and plugins, which is ThemeForest and Code Canyon, well then in that case, you probably need to still include your POMO files. So first you delete your load plugin text domain bit and the function that surrounds it. Then you delete the language folder. Then you increment your plugin version and release. Simple as that. Hopefully you'll be able to figure that part out. That's easy. But then how do you add new translations? So suppose you want to add a new translation in or get someone who wants to do that. You visit translate.wordpress.org. You choose your locale. So that looks like this. There's a big long list and you go, oh, I speak, well, we need a Yiddish translation, so I speak Yiddish, right? And then lastly, you find the plugin or theme that you want to translate. So you just do a search like you would normally. I've searched for Stream, click on Stream, and you can see these big buttons. You hit Translate Project. And as simple as that, you take into like this GlotPress WordPress translation environment, and that's that. It'll eventually be approved and all of that sort of stuff. Yep, I'm done. So if you want more information on translation, you can read the translator's handbook in the codex or join core-I18N in Slack. All right, so we've covered the REST API, we've covered the customizer, and we've covered translation. Thanks for listening. I take questions, but they're about to kick me out. Oh, time for questions. That's a pity. No, don't take his question.
I just want to be clear with the translations. So when you use the translations function, you use the slug of your plugin. Is that right? So just as still for the text domain, you use the slug of your plugin.
Yeah, so you don't need to. I don't think you need to load plugin text domain anymore.
No, you don't do plugin text domain, but when you actually use the translation function.
Oh yes, you still need to use. Oh yeah. To be clear about that, it's not like you can just start outputting strings, especially not unescaped ones. You still need to use underscore or underscore e with your plugin text domain at the end. That's how WordPress finds the strings. Yeah, thanks for that question.
I have two questions.
No.
No. So,
I mean, you can add and customize a section without JavaScript.
right, so that's my question, is why would you write it in PHP if it doesn't work without JavaScript?
No, so you can write it completely. You can write a new section completely in PHP. Yeah, the customizer itself is built on JavaScript to a big extent,
So,
but
if you wrote it in PHP, what would be the advantage to just using JavaScript? Is there any?
yeah, there is. Which is so we found this out when we were working on sites that had hundreds of posts or even thousands, and we were wanting to customize particular aspects of a post, for example. What would happen is in PHP is that those sections were loaded for every single post. Whereas if we used the JavaScript API to customize them, then that section is only loaded, like it's loaded on the fly, and so it doesn't slow WordPress down. Does that make sense? I'm not sure if I'm being 100% clear.
I'm asking the other way around, like, why would you write it in PHP?
Why would you write it in PHP when you could just write it in JavaScript? Maybe you're unfamiliar with JavaScript. I would say there's no good reason to develop it in PHP unless you're unsure on what to do in JavaScript, in which case just learn. Yeah.
Okay.
Just in regards to the trends that you were talking about, so do you find sometimes that, actually I found in a lot of cases that a lot of the trends, like you mentioned, Power Help, Gram, even going to React, some of them are actually more like a fake trends.
Mm.
Just big company releases the platform, everyone jumps on it. In my experience, is actually in a lot of cases they're just not bring anything with any time set, and a lot of them are just like starting to done, like with the files at the moment it's done, and there are so many projects that can be done it. So how would you actually, as a lead, how would you sort the like good trends versus bad trends, and how would you actually choose the best technology of choice in terms of popularity?
Good question. Yeah. So the question, which I should have been repeating all the questions, sorry. Question is, how do I pick my trend? How do I pick the right choice when it comes to Less or Sass or, Bower or Composer or whatever, And the only answer I can give is like, you do your best. Like, nobody can predict the future. But I would just add to that it's important, in my experience, I believe that I've made the mistake of not picking any trend. I think it's better to pick the wrong one than it is to pick nothing. Does that make sense? So if you've jumped on the Bower train, and you think, okay, it's dying now, it's going to be much easier for you to understand a competing technology and switch to that than it will be for someone who never wanted to get on board with anything in the first place.
I think we'll have to end it there. Thanks, Luke.
Thanks so much.
Everyone here would like to present you with this custom box of chocolates, which I'm sure you'll enjoy. But on behalf of everyone here, thanks for a very informative talk. I think we've all learned something that we didn't know before.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.